When Europe, Africa, and Asia first encountered the Americas, they started this exchange between two worlds that had never collided before. In bringing these two worlds together, the world became more interconnected as it had never been before. So of course this benefited some people, and this would really be catastrophic for other people, but the world is becoming more and more connected, and we're going to look at that through the lens of trade today. But first I want to start off with kind of reviewing where Europe is in all of this. We're looking at the 1500s. What does Europe look like? And we mentioned a bit in the previous lecture, but I want to just recap some things. So Europe is pretty much racked by religious warfare, and it's looking different than places such as the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, and Ming China, which we're also going to look at today. Those were strong centralized empires with a strong central government that had power and exercised that power outwards to its people. Europe was not united, it was fragmented, and really had not been very powerful up to this point. So, I mean, historically, in our recent memory, we think of Europe and then later America as these world superpowers, not just militarily but culturally. But that is a recent phenomenon, and it was not the case in the 1500s. Europe was made up of a lot of different fragmented kingdoms, and the only thing that really unified them was the Catholic Church. So the Pope was the head of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church exercised control over pretty much all of the European kingdoms. They had to grant legitimacy to any would-be king or monarch in Europe. If they did not have the Pope's approval, they were not going to be effective rulers. They were not going to be seen as legitimate rulers over their people because they didn't have God's blessing. So the Pope, and in extension the Catholic Church, was the unifying factor in Europe, bringing all of those kingdoms kind of into some type of common cause with one another, even though there was warfare, of course, between these kingdoms. And you have different attempts over the past 1,000 years of different European leaders, generals, monarchs trying to bring back the Roman Empire that had fallen 1,000 years before. So they saw themselves oftentimes as the successor of the Roman Empire. They wanted to bring back its glory, unify Europe in one big empire once again, and you have a lot of different people trying to do this, even into the more modern history, but that never really is successful. And here in the 1500s, you see Roman right there on the map, Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't Roman, as you can tell, didn't even control Rome. It pretty much controlled what is today Germany. It had an emperor, but the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was not really very powerful, and the local princes of all of these different regions in the Holy Roman Empire exercised most of the power. So it was more like a loose-knit group of princes connected under an emperor who didn't really have that much power. He had to bargain with the princes. Nothing like the Eastern empires that we're going to look at later. This fell apart even more when the Protestant Reformation fractured the Catholic Church. So the one unifying entity in Europe was then fractured, and Europe was divided even among itself. So just a quick recap, the Protestant Reformation was a German monk named Martin Luther said, hey, I have some issues with the way the Catholic Church is progressing. He himself was part of the Catholic Church, but he wanted to have a debate and a discussion over certain corrupt practices that he had a problem with. However, when he brought up these grievances to his peers and the Catholic Church at large, they told him to stop talking about it. And when he wouldn't stop talking about it, they kicked him out of the church. He was excommunicated. And once he was kicked out of the Catholic Church, a lot of people who read his work and heard him speak said, hey, this Martin Luther guy is onto something. They broke away from the church. Some of them were convinced because of religious conviction that the Catholic Church was corrupt and needed to be reformed or protested against, and people should be able to branch out and have their own personal relationship with God, Jesus, without needing the Catholic Church, and that they should be able to read the Bible in their own language, and all of these different kinds of ideas that kind of democratized religion for Europeans. Again, some because of this religious conviction, others because of political grievances. They didn't want their tax money going to the Pope and going to Rome. So they broke away from the Catholic Church to keep their money local. Others, like the English King Henry VIII, broke away from the Catholic Church because the Pope didn't let him divorce his wife and he wanted a divorce, so he left the church. That's all to say, Europe fractures religiously. They're all Christian still, but they're no longer part of the Catholic Church. And because of this, Europe is racked with warfare. You have warfare between different kingdoms. So if you're the King of France and you decide that you want to remain Catholic and your whole nation needs to be Catholic with you, then everybody has to be Catholic. And if there's any Protestants in France, there's warfare between them or massacre between them. If England decides, the king decides he wants to be Protestant, he forces all of his followers to become Protestant with him. And if they refuse, there's bloodshed. So there's bloodshed within all of these nations, but also between these nations. So now England is Protestant, France is Catholic, they're fighting each other. So everybody's fighting each other, and this is kind of exemplified in something called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This takes place in France, which remains steadfastly Catholic throughout history. But there were French Protestants, and in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Catholics went through the streets of France and massacred Protestants and threw them into the river. This just exemplifies what Europe looked like during this time. And it was this religious fervor and zeal that inspired a lot of Europeans to explore, to go across, look for new trade routes, and enrich their own countries and spread their own versions of Christianity. But the whole purpose of getting riches through this trade with Asia, was to strengthen their country in Europe so that they were Protestant, so that the Protestants would be the most powerful in Europe if they were Catholic, so the Catholics would be the most powerful in Europe. So they're all just kind of vying for power within Europe between one another, and they see trade as one way to get power and wealth. They want to trade with Asia, specifically China and India, but before they started exploiting resources from the Americas, they really didn't have anything to trade with. So they were trying to sail west and find India or China, but they really didn't have any resources that China wanted. And that is until the Europeans started extracting silver from the Americas, specifically Spain. Spain would extract a lot of silver out of the Americas using enslaved and exploited Native American labor. And they would use that silver to finally start trading with China. You also have the start of the African slave trade, where specifically the Portuguese started sailing out and creating port cities on the coast of Africa and trading with African kings and princes, giving them something from Europe and then buying African slaves and selling them abroad. And these enslaved people would then farm all of these different cash crops that would make Europeans very, very rich and give them something to trade. And it is important to note that this type of slavery that develops is different than the type of slavery that was practiced in Africa and the rest of the world through most of human history, where if you were an enslaved person, it was usually because you owed somebody a debt or because you were conquered by another tribe or people. And when you became a slave, you usually retained a certain degree of rights and personhood. Oftentimes you could have an occupation. You can practice a craft. You might be a tutor. Think ancient Rome or Greece. A lot of Greek people were slaves to Romans, and they would tutor Roman children and teach them the Greek classics and philosophy and all of this. And they would sometimes gain a lot of power. So if you were Caesar's slave, you would actually have some power and status in society. In Africa and most of the world, it was the same thing. If you were a slave, a lot of times you lived with the family, you kind of became part of the family after a time. Oftentimes you would earn your freedom or just be granted your freedom later on. It wasn't like a permanent status for most of, in most places. And it certainly wasn't passed down to your children. So if you were a slave, it was because of what happened to you. You were loser of a battle or you owed a debt, but it didn't mean that your children and your children's children would become slaves. This changes with African slavery, and we'll talk more about that later, where every generation for 400 plus years are kept into slavery because of the race and the color of their skin. That is all to say that the entrance of Europeans into the African slave trade and the acquisition of American silver is going to enrich Europeans and start to help them become players on the field, whereas beforehand they really weren't. And now they had something to trade with these great empires to the east that we're going to talk about next. So over in India, most of the continent was ruled by the Mughal Empire. They started out really in the north of India, but over several centuries they would conquer most of the continent of India. And the Mughal Empire was started by a warlord from Uzbekistan, what is currently Uzbekistan, who moved into India, conquered it. It was a Muslim group who would establish this empire. So the Mughal Empire was a Muslim empire, but they ruled over a very diverse group of people. India is a very diverse place. Even today, hundreds of languages, different groups. It's not this one monolithic group, but the empire itself was centralized. So the power was strong in the center. And if the emperor made decrees, the people listened. It was a strong, central, wealthy empire, not like Europe. Nevertheless, though it was strong, it exercised religious tolerance over its people. Though the empire was a Muslim empire, they had a lot of Hindu people living within it. They had some Christians, they had Jews, they had a lot of other different religions in India at the time, but the Mughal Empire practiced tolerance for all of these religions and even encouraged religious debate among all of these different groups of people. One emperor in particular would bring all of these different religious leaders together and say, hey, let's have a debate, let's talk about our differences. But it was that spirit of tolerance, of fostering debate, of fostering discussion that characterized the Mughal Empire. And that looks very different than Europe at this moment, which even among itself, it was all the same religion, it was all Christian, was fighting amongst one another. India was a very wealthy nation at the time, and Europeans coveted certain luxury items from India, such as silk and cotton textiles. So European elites especially wanted this for themselves. They wanted to be dressed in the finest silks and the finest textiles from India. But again, at first, they didn't really have anything interesting for India itself. The first to start trading with India would be Portuguese traders who, as you can tell, would establish coastal cities such as Bombay here, or occupy coastal cities that already existed, and especially they would want to be occupying strategic ports, so they could bring in European goods to these port cities, sell it to Indian merchants, and then buy Indian goods from Indian merchants and take it back to Europe. So they weren't trying to colonize, they weren't trying to establish empires or occupy land. Later the Dutch would come, the English would come as well. And these early traders are just occupying or establishing port cities where their people could trade with India, and it was kind of mutually beneficial. The Mughals would benefit from this trade, the Europeans would of course benefit from this trade, but none of them are trying to establish colonies like they are in the Americas. Part of the reason is because the Mughal Empire was so powerful. If these small bands of European merchants and traders tried to go up against them, or even these European nations as a whole, they didn't really stand much of a chance against the Mughal Empire. But later, we will see the balance of power shifts. As we know, centuries later, India is colonized by Europeans. At this moment, the power is really tilted towards the Mughal Empire, and the Europeans were just kind of small players on the map. Same thing in China. China's ruled by the Ming dynasty, and they are very wealthy, they are very powerful, and they're more inward looking. So they could have sent vast expeditions out, but they saw their empire prosper and wealthy, and Europeans saw their empire as prosperous and wealthy, and they were in awe of China, really, of Chinese cities. And China was more focused on their empire on the land. They weren't looking out to the sea as much. They were incredibly populous, so they had some of the largest cities in the world, and they produced a lot of luxury items, just like India did, that Europeans wanted. So you could see their land trade was mostly tea to people like the Mongols, who would give them horses, but they would ship out certain goods such as ceramics and silks that Europeans really wanted, because again, it was a sign of luxury. So if you had the finest Chinese silks or ceramics or porcelain, it was something to be coveted. Think of the expression like display your finest china. This is really what it comes from. It was a status symbol, it was a luxury good. And Europeans really didn't have access to it until they started exploiting Native American labor to mine silver for them and trade with China, because China's currency was silver, but China didn't have enough silver themselves. So once they started getting American silver from the Europeans were able to start trading that for their luxury goods. And again, it's this mutually beneficial relationship where the Europeans established some port trading posts, such as Macau here. This was a Portuguese trading port on the coast of China. They would bring in European goods and take out Chinese goods, and it was mutually beneficial. The Europeans weren't really seen as a threat at this time. Now, shifting our focus towards Anatolia and the Middle East, we have the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was started when bands of Turkic peoples came out of Central Asia into what is we consider the Middle East, and started conquering that area, present-day Turkey, from the Greeks and Armenians. The empire of the day was a Greek empire, and the Turks would eventually defeat this Greek empire and conquer Constantinople and later rename it Istanbul. And by doing that, we have Istanbul right here. They paved the way for the empire to expand into Europe. So they conquer Greece, they conquer the Balkans, but these are all Christian people. And those that they conquered in their heartland, present-day Turkey, were also Christian people. They were mostly Armenians, Greeks, and other people. So it was this small minority of Muslim Turks ruling over Christian people. That changed in the 1500s when the Ottoman Empire expanded into the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, Palestine, Northern Africa, and now they started encompassing a lot of Muslim people into their empire, so the balance shifts from a minority of Muslims ruling over Christians to a Muslim majority empire. And that's when Ottoman sultans or kings started to call themselves caliphs. And the caliph was basically a position that combined a secular rule, such as, the kingship, with religious authority. So basically, I'm the religious authority over Islam, but also the secular king over this empire. And I'm both of these in one position. So Ottomans, sultans started to call themselves caliphs, and they said that they ruled over the caliphate. So they ruled over the Muslim world. And it's this empire that really blocked Europe from trading with Asia over land. And it's this empire that convinced Europeans that they had to sail west and try to find new ways to trade with China and India. And as you can tell, the Ottoman Empire is just in this very strategic location between Europe, Asia, Africa. All of this trade has to go through their empire. So they taxed all that trade and became increasingly rich off of it. They created these rest stops along the way called caravanserais, where they would house people. It's kind of like a hotel, a rest stop. They would have refreshments for you. You would take your horses in there. You would sleep on these little cots, and you would have to pay taxes to the Ottomans along the way. So the Ottomans are getting money out of Europeans, Africa, Asia, as they're conducting trade through their empire. I actually went to one of these when I was in Armenia, and it was pretty neat. It was kind of like a long stone building. It was empty on the inside, of course, but you would have taken your animals in there. You would have slept in there while you were on the road, and it would have provided you shelter as you were on the road to trade. But these are all very strong empires: the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and Ming China. They had central governments, they were powerful, it looked very different from Europe. However, that balance of power started to change during this period because of the Americas. So kind of harkening back to our first lecture, the original reason that the Spanish sent Christopher Columbus west was to find Asia and India and avoid passing the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to circle around, sail one way, end up on the other side of the world. They would eventually actually do this when they conquered Manila, which would later become the capital of the Philippines, which Spain ruled. When Spain conquered the Philippines and colonized the Philippines, they had a connection to China. So from Mexico, the Spanish Empire would send slaves and silver to the Philippines, and the Philippines was not too far from China. So from the Philippines, they could take those goods up to China. So trade would have gone from Spain to Mexico to the Philippines to China and then back. So Spain was able to circumnavigate the world. They were able to go make the full circle from Europe all the way around the Americas to China, because they controlled all of these key ports and areas. And by doing this, they were able to send their silver from the Americas straight to China and import silks and porcelains from China, making, of course, Spain very rich. And one of the main ideas I kind of want us to focus on in this lecture is the difference between these different empires that we're looking at. And the Ming, the Mughals, and the Ottomans really focused on their land empires, which were strong. They had vast territories, and they were quite wealthy. They were populous. But what we start to see is the Europeans, who were often very small nations like the Dutch and the Portuguese and England, focus more on sending navies out and controlling trade and facilitating trade. They were intermediaries. So they started off as not really a threat. They just controlled a couple port cities and a couple very big empires. But eventually, by controlling these port cities and by being intermediaries between a bunch of different groups of people and facilitating trade between them, they started to gain power and wealth. And the balance starts to shift from these empires, these big land empires, to these trading empires out of Europe, the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese. So we have a connected world now, a world that's trading with one another, that has contact with one another from pretty much every continent now. And the people who really start to gain power in this interconnected world are the ones who are facilitating trade, who are controlling trade, and who are exploring rather than land empires. So over the next couple of centuries, again, we see this balance of power shift from these large land empires to Europe.